We go now to Bruce Klingner, Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation. He was also the CIA's Deputy Division Chief for Korea. Bruce, good to have you on the show. Thank you very much, first of all. So what happens now? I mean, surely it cannot be back to business in South Korea, considering what's happened in the past 12 hours or less.
It was certainly a shocking development. I was in Seoul less than 2 weeks ago meeting with senior officials, and there was no indication that Yoon would take such a drastic step, or even any warnings that he was becoming increasingly frustrated with the legislature. So certainly a shocking development, which then became more of a bizarre development when 6 hours later he rescinded his martial law declaration. So right now, as the reporters pointed out, he really is, I think he's written his political obituary. He's certainly given much greater foundation for impeachment to the opposition party than any grounds that they would have had before. He complained that the opposition had paralyzed the government, but as the majority party, they could do that within the means of the rules. And he also complained about all the impeachment efforts against him as well as his cabinet minister. But it certainly doesn't seem like he can remain in power. I would think that he would likely have impeachment measures against him in a very short period of time now.
Right. So, definitely a surprise development. But, some people are not surprised, saying that the events that led to President Yoon's declaration of martial law were actually set in motion well before all of this. Help us understand why President Yoon and the opposition are so at odds. How did they get here? I mean, what were the most contentious issues that really just drove such a deep divide?
Well, the South Korean electorate, like many, are very deeply divided. And in South Korea, you have the conservative and the progressive elements, which have very different views on domestic issues as well as on foreign policy. In April, the opposition party won a resounding success, a resounding victory in the National Assembly elections, giving them a very strong power to either impede President Yoon's executive efforts as well as to initiate their own legislative proposals. So whereas in the United States, we focus primarily on the foreign and security policies, the election issue in April, as well as what the National Assembly has been focused on, is more economic reform as well as other domestic issues. And they have stymied President Yoon's policy initiatives, so he's grown increasingly frustrated with that. When he initially announced the declaration for martial law, it had seemed he was accusing sort of unidentified groups of covertly plotting to overthrow the government. And then in the formal announcement, it was really just the opposition, and what he was citing was them railroading a budget bill, which they can do as the majority party, and the impeachments, and then sort of unfounded accusations that they're pro-North Korean or a den of thieves. So the means or the means that he sought to use didn't justify the action that he took. So I think when we saw that the ruling party was harshly critical, as was the opposition party, he doesn't really have any political allies for such a blatant extra constitutional action.
Understood. So, Bruce, given that this Hail Mary move seems to have failed, and you just mentioned that his own party also condemned the declaration, I mean, is there anything that he can do, President Yoon, to salvage the situation? I mean, the public doesn't seem to be on his side either. I mean, I think his approval rating was hovering at 20-25% in the most recent survey?
Right. His approval was already very low. And I think the citizenry will be united against this kind of action. It dredges up painful memories of South Korea's authoritarian past, the military coups, the authoritarian leaders, acts against human rights and the rule of law and constitution in South Korea during those years. And so it's been 44 years since the last declaration of martial law. And in the 1980s, democratization really took hold in South Korea. And they're very proud of that. And they have been working very hard, not only to create the economic miracle on the Han River, as it's called, but also very strong memories against those authoritarian leaders. So this will be, I think, an insult to all South Koreans. It's very much a dark stain on South Korea's history. And I think everyone will really be united against President Yoon remaining in office.
Yeah, and I wonder whether there are wider ramifications beyond South Korea, whether this puts into question South Korea's reliability as an ally to the U.S., or whether the incident could embolden the North. What kind of action could Pyongyang take?
Well, I don't think Pyongyang will take advantage of it in the sense of military action, but they certainly will score propaganda victories. They'll point to Yoon as being the reason for rising tensions on the peninsula. They'll call him unreliable, and they may try to implicate the U.S. indirectly by saying, since we have troops here, we must have known that's what he was going to do. And then they'll raise past incidents such as what's called the Gwangju incident in 1980, where the U.S. was falsely accused of being involved in that or condoning that action. So, from the U.S. point of view, we are going through a presidential transition right now. There's a great deal of uncertainty of what foreign policies, President Trump will implement. But just in the last month or two, we now have a change in leadership in Japan, where Prime Minister Ishiba called a snap election, which did not go well for his party. They lost the majority, and so now Japan is much more inward-looking, probably less likely to deliver on its bold defense reform and foreign policies. And now South Korea, which until today was seen as a strong, reliable partner, in a way now joins Japan as the weak man of Asia. So the U.S., at a time when we're trying to push back against the multifaceted China threat, we now have two allies in Southeast Asia that are going to be more inward-looking and less able to deliver on efforts to push back against the North Korean and China threats.
Bruce, just want to quickly go back to the domestic situation now, if I may. So what happens next, assuming that Yoon is indeed impeached or resigns? How does it work? I mean, does his vice president take over? Do we go to elections next? What happens?
Well, likely we'll see a special presidential election within 60 days after his impeachment, as was the case when Park Geun-hye was impeached a few years ago. And the opposition would likely win that. Not only do they have the majority in the legislature, but their polls are higher than the President Yoon's. And they would implement much different policies than the conservative ruling party. On foreign policy, much more conciliatory approaches towards North Korea and China. The progressives have historically tried to downgrade or distance themselves from the alliance with the United States. And then on domestic issues, much more progressive economic and social issues. So it really could be a very drastic change in leadership and change in policies by South Korea in a very near term.
All right, Bruce, really appreciate your time. Bruce Klingner there, a senior research fellow for Northeast Asia at the Heritage Foundation.